There are moments when a story does not arrive with noise or urgency, but with quiet confusion. Nothing is announced, no alarms sound, yet something feels off. This is one of those moments. It began not with a press conference or an official statement, but with absence. A familiar name stopped appearing where it usually did. Invitations went unanswered. Long-standing relationships grew silent. For people who closely watch public figures and the systems that surround them, these silences rarely happen by accident. At first, there was no clear explanation. Some assumed it was timing. Others thought it was a private choice. But as days passed, the quiet became harder to ignore. Industry insiders noticed patterns. Observers compared notes. And slowly, a different picture began to form. This was not a single event. It was a series of small changes that, taken together, suggested something more complex was unfolding. The kind of situation where no one rushes to speak, because no one wants to be the first to say the wrong thing. Public commentary began to shift. Online discussions asked careful questions rather than making claims. Why had certain doors closed at the same time? Why were long-standing arrangements suddenly being reconsidered? And why did people close to the situation appear unusually cautious? What made the situation more unsettling was the lack of clear denial. No firm clarification was offered. No simple explanation arrived to settle the discussion. Instead, there was a growing sense that decisions were being made quietly, behind the scenes, in spaces the public rarely sees. Stories like this often develop slowly. They do not rely on dramatic revelations. They build through timing, behavior, and the way institutions react when they believe attention is coming their way. This is not a story about confirmed wrongdoing. It is not an announcement of guilt or innocence. It is a closer look at a situation that continues to raise questions, not because of what has been said, but because of what has not. And as more people began paying attention, it became clear that this was not fading. It was just beginning to take shape. To understand why this discussion gained momentum, it helps to step back and look at the environment in which it developed. In this world, image is currency. Public figures move through carefully managed systems built on trust, reputation, and unspoken rules. When those systems work, they are invisible. When they strain, small cracks become visible long before anything breaks. The central figure in this story did not rise quietly. From the beginning, attention followed her closely. Her presence brought visibility, debate, and strong opinions. Supporters praised her confidence and modern approach. Critics questioned her methods and consistency. What remained constant was attention. Wherever she went, the spotlight followed. After stepping away from traditional structures, she entered a different landscape. This new space was less formal but more transactional. Relationships were based on mutual benefit rather than tradition. Visibility mattered, but so did reliability. In this environment, nothing was free in the long term. Every favor created expectation. Every exception was remembered. At first, things appeared smooth. Appearances were polished. Partnerships were announced. Media coverage framed the transition as bold and independent. There was a sense that the system would adapt around her. For a time, it did. But behind the public surface, adjustments were already happening. According to public commentary, some collaborators found the pace demanding. Others noted shifting expectations. None of this was unusual on its own. High-profile figures often require complex coordination. What stood out was how often plans seemed to change after commitments were made. Observers who follow these industries closely noticed an increase in quiet recalibration. Certain brands became less visible. Long-rumored projects stalled. Invitations that once seemed automatic became uncertain. Again, no single moment explained the shift. It was cumulative. People familiar with similar situations often describe this phase as the cooling period. It is when enthusiasm gives way to evaluation. Decisions are no longer driven by excitement, but by risk assessment. In these moments, institutions ask simple questions. Is this partnership predictable? Is it sustainable? Does it create more stability than uncertainty? Public discussions online reflected this change in tone. Instead of celebrating announcements, conversations focused on logistics and follow-through. Why were some collaborations announced but never completed? Why did certain appearances feel improvised rather than planned? These were not accusations. They were observations. At the same time, the broader environment was changing. Economic pressures made organizations more cautious. Public scrutiny intensified. Reputations became more fragile. In this CL. Innate tolerance for ambiguity decreased. Systems that once absorbed friction began to resist it. This is where the situation began to shift more noticeably. According to industry chatter, internal reviews became more common. Policies were revisited. Informal practices were replaced with stricter guidelines. What had once been flexible became procedural. For public figures accustomed to exceptions, this transition can feel abrupt. The rules have not changed, but their enforcement has. What once passed without question now required documentation. What once relied on trust now required verification. None of this suggests wrongdoing. It suggests a system protecting itself. Large organizations do this instinctively. When uncertainty rises, they narrow margins for error. During this period, silence became more pronounced. Fewer public statements were issued. Representation appeared cautious. Communication shifted from proactive to reactive. This change did not go unnoticed. Some commentators framed it as strategic retreat. Others saw it as recalibration. Still others wondered whether unresolved issues were being addressed privately. Without official confirmation, all interpretations remained speculative. What is clear is that momentum slowed. The steady rhythm of appearances and announcements lost its consistency. For someone whose influence depended on visibility, this mattered. This is where questions began to accumulate, not because of a single allegation, but because of pattern recognition. When multiple doors pause at once, people wonder why. When institutions align in their caution, observers take note. This does not mean conclusions can be drawn. It means context matters. The background of this story is not one dramatic moment, but a gradual tightening of expectations around someone used to fluid boundaries. As these pressures increased, the conversation naturally moved from admiration to analysis, and with analysis came more careful attention to detail. This is the point where the discussion shifted from what was happening to why it might be happening. At this point, many people started asking questions, not because they had answers, but because the usual explanations no longer fit. When patterns repeat across different spaces, curiosity becomes difficult to dismiss. One of the first questions centered on expectations. In high-profile environments, expectations are rarely written down. They are learned through experience. People observe what is accepted, what is overlooked, and what quietly causes friction. When someone moves between systems, those expectations can clash. Public commentary suggested that the figure at the center of this story often operated as if flexibility was guaranteed. This approach can work for a time, especially when attention and goodwill are high, but flexibility depends on trust. Once trust begins to thin, even small deviations feel larger. Observers noted that some arrangements appeared to rely on informal understandings rather than clear agreements. This is not unusual in creative or celebrity-driven spaces. However, when outcomes disappoint or details are disputed, informal systems offer little protection for either side. Questions also emerged around timing. Several instances followed a similar rhythm. An appearance would generate attention. Shortly after, the relationship behind that appearance seemed to pause or dissolve. This happened quietly, without conflict becoming public, which made it harder to interpret. Some online discussions suggested that expectations on both sides may not have aligned. One side may have expected long-term commitment. The other may have seen each engagement as temporary. Without clear communication, disappointment is almost inevitable. Another area of discussion focused on intermediaries. High-profile figures rarely manage details alone. Teams, advisors, and assistants act on their behalf. When misunderstandings occur, responsibility becomes difficult to trace. Was a decision intentional, assumed, or misunderstood? This ambiguity fueled speculation, though nothing was confirmed. Commentators were careful to frame their thoughts as questions rather than claims. Who was making final decisions? Were boundaries clearly set? Were assumptions being challenged too late? As these questions circulated, attention turned to systems rather than individuals. Large organizations operate on precedent. When an exception is made once, it creates expectation for the future. Over time, exceptions can weaken structure. Eventually, systems correct themselves. This correction often looks impersonal. Policies tighten, access narrows, communication becomes formal. From the outside, it can feel sudden. From the inside, it feels overdue. Public observers began noticing signs of this shift. Language changed. Where praise once dominated, statements became neutral. Where enthusiasm once led, caution followed. This did not suggest hostility. It suggested recalibration. Me wondered whether earlier goodwill had masked underlying strain. Others questioned whether rapid visibility created unrealistic assumptions about influence. Visibility does not always equal leverage, especially in environments where legacy and consistency matter. Another recurring question involved sustainability. Could the pace and style that initially drew attention be maintained long-term? Public attention can amplify success, but it also magnifies friction. Every misstep appears larger under scrutiny. In online forums and commentary spaces, people debated whether this was a temporary phase or a structural shift. Would relationships reset once expectations aligned, or had trust eroded beyond easy repair? What followed only added to the confusion. There were moments when a return to form seemed possible. Appearances were teased, projects were hinted at, then silence returned. Each cycle reinforced uncertainty. Importantly, no official explanations arrived to anchor the narrative. Without confirmation, speculation remained contained but persistent. The absence of denial was not proof of anything, but it left space for interpretation. This is how prolonged discussions form, not from dramatic claims, but from unanswered questions layered over time. Each unanswered question adds weight, even if none are decisive on their own. As attention continued, some commentators pointed out that similar patterns had appeared in other cases involving public figures transitioning between systems. Initial excitement gives way to structural reality. Influence is tested. Boundaries assert themselves. In those cases, outcomes varied. Some adapted, others withdrew. A few redefined their role entirely. Which path this situation might follow remained unclear. What was clear is that the discussion had moved beyond surface-level commentary. People were no longer asking who was right or wrong. They were asking how systems respond when expectations diverge. This shift marked a turning point. The story was no longer about individual moments. It was about process. And once process becomes the focus, attention tends to deepen rather than fade. This is where the situation began to feel less like a passing moment and more like an ongoing evaluation. This is where the situation began to change in a more visible way. Patterns that once seemed isolated started to connect, not in a dramatic or explosive manner, but quietly through repetition. Observers noticed that the same types of adjustments kept happening. Access became limited, communication routes narrowed, interactions that were once informal became structured. None of these moves were announced, but together they suggested a shift in posture from several institutions at the same time. According to public commentary, this kind of coordinated caution usually appears when organizations sense risk, even if that risk has not been publicly defined. It is not about assigning blame. It is about protecting systems that rely on predictability. One pattern involved timing. Certain collaborations appeared to reach a natural stopping point right after moments of high visibility. The attention peaked, then receded. Instead of building momentum, the cycle reset. Over time, this repetition raised questions about sustainability rather than popularity. Another pattern involved representation. Advisors and intermediaries seemed to change roles or step back. In some cases, relationships that were once presented as stable became transactional. This is often a sign that expectations are being renegotiated behind the scenes. Some commentators suggested that the figure at the center of the story operated with an assumption of continued exception. Exceptions can work when they are rare. When they become routine, they lose power. Systems eventually respond by restoring baseline rules. Public discussions also focused on how influence is measured. Visibility creates the impression of leverage, but leverage depends on outcomes. If outcomes create friction, visibility alone cannot compensate. This distinction matters in environments built on long-term reputation. As these conversations grew more detailed, people began comparing notes across industries. Patterns seen in media partnerships mirrored those in other professional spaces. The same pauses, the same careful language, the same lack of definitive closure. Importantly, none of this confirmed any specific claim. It simply illustrated consistency in response. When multiple organizations react similarly without coordination, observers tend to assume shared concerns rather than coincidence. This stage of the story did not produce headlines. It produced hesitation, and hesitation is often more telling than rejection. It signals uncertainty rather than opposition. Some observers noted that the situation resembled a review phase. In corporate environments, reviews happen quietly. They involve documentation, assessment, and scenario planning. Outcomes are not ruse. They are measured. Online commentary reflected this shift. Language became analytical. Instead of speculation about motives, discussions focused on structure. How do institutions manage reputational risk? How do they respond when expectations diverge from practice? Another element that added tension was the lack of visible recovery. In many cases, reputational dips are followed by correction, a clear statement, a new partnership, a decisive move. Here, none appeared to settle the discussion. Each attempt to move forward seemed tentative. Announcements were smaller, commitments shorter, follow-through less visible. This did not suggest failure, but it suggested caution. This growing caution affected perception. When momentum slows, narratives fill the gap. Even neutral silence can be interpreted as unresolved tension. This is not fair, but it is common. At the same time, defenders pointed out that stepping back can be strategic. Not every pause signals trouble. Some are deliberate, some protect privacy. These arguments held weight, but they did not erase the visible patterns. As weeks turned into months, the accumulation of these signals made the story harder to ignore. It was no longer about a single relationship or decision. It was about how many similar adjustments had occurred without explanation. This is the stage where attention deepens rather than spikes. People stop waiting for a reveal and start tracking behavior. They look for consistency rather than confirmation. And consistency in this case appeared in the form of restraint from institutions, restraint from partners, and notably restraint in public communication. This restraint did not end the discussion, it extended it. Because when systems grow quiet at the same time, people assume something is being evaluated, and evaluation, by nature, takes time. This is why the story did not fade. It entered a holding pattern, suspended between speculation and resolution, with no clear signal of which direction it would move next. As this holding pattern continued, attention naturally shifted outward, toward the way the public, the media, and established institutions were responding. This is often where a situation becomes more defined, not through statements, but through behavior. Media coverage began to change in tone. Early reporting had emphasized possibility and transformation. Now, articles leaned toward analysis and distance. Language became cautious. Phrases were framed carefully. Instead of projecting future plans, coverage focused on what had already happened and what had quietly paused. This shift did not come with accusations. It came with restraint. Editors appeared careful not to overstate or speculate too far ahead. At the same time, they did not dismiss the ongoing discussion. The story remained present, but it moved to a different section of the conversation. Public reaction followed a similar path. Supporters remained loyal, but even among them, questions surfaced. Not about intent, but about outcome. Why had so many initiatives slowed at once? Why did progress appear uneven? These were not hostile questions. They reflected concern and confusion. Critics, meanwhile, avoided direct claims. Instead, they pointed to patterns. They referenced timing. They compared previous expectations with current reality. The tone was less emotional and more observational. Institutions responded in their own quiet ways. Invitations became more selective. Access points narrowed. According to public commentary, this is typical when organizations reassess risk. They do not announce exclusion. They simply reduce engagement. Some observers noted that this response was not unique. Similar patterns appear whenever a high-profile figure transitions from one system to another and challenges existing norms. Institutions often wait. They observe. They allow time to clarify direction. What stood out in this case was how many institutions appeared to reach the same posture independently. No single organization defined the response. Instead, a shared caution seemed to settle across multiple spaces. Online discussions reflected this convergence. People debated whether the response was fair. Some argued that expectations had been unrealistic from the start. Others believed the figure involved was being held to a higher standard. Both views circulated without resolution. Importantly, no institution publicly accused or condemned. Silence remained the dominant response. This silence was not empty. It carried weight because of who maintained it. In media spaces, commentators emphasized uncertainty. They reminded audiences that absence of confirmation does not equal confirmation of wrongdoing. They urged patience. At the same time, they acknowledged that sustained silence can shape perception. This tension influenced public mood. Interest did not disappear. It became subdued. People watched for small signals, a new appearance, a clarified partnership, a defeat. Native statement. Each potential sign was examined closely. Some signals appeared, but they were limited. Nothing arrived with enough clarity to reset the narrative. As a result, the discussion continued, neither escalating nor resolving. This kind of prolonged uncertainty often leads to fatigue, yet in this case, attention persisted. Not because of drama, but because of incompleteness. The story felt unfinished. Institutions, meanwhile, continued operating according to their internal timelines. Reviews take time. Decisions require consensus. In environments that value stability, speed is rarely prioritized. Public commentary began framing the situation as an example rather than an exception. Analysts discussed it alongside other cases where visibility did not guarantee influence. They highlighted the difference between public attention and institutional trust. This reframing shifted the conversation away from personality and toward structure. It became less about who someone is and more about how systems respond to pressure. By this stage, the story had moved beyond headlines. It had become a case study in slow motion. Each reaction, or lack of reaction, added context. This is why the discussion did not fade with the news cycle. It adapted to it, and as it adapted, it drew in a different kind of audience, one less interested in spectacle and more interested in understanding. This broader interest ensured that the story continued, not as breaking news, but as an ongoing question. This is why the discussion has not faded. Stories like this rarely end with a clear moment of resolution. Instead, they persist because they sit at the intersection of visibility, power, and uncertainty. Each element reinforces the others. The central reason the story continues is that no definitive conclusion has been offered. There has been no clear reset, no decisive pivot that closes one chapter and begins another. In the absence of that clarity, attention lingers. Another factor is scale. This situation is not confined to a single industry or relationship. It touches media, branding, public perception, and institutional behavior all at once. When multiple systems respond in similar ways, observers sense significance, even if they cannot yet define it. Public figures often recover from setbacks through momentum. A new project reframes the narrative. A successful appearance restores confidence. Here, momentum has been inconsistent. Efforts to move forward appear careful, measured, and limited. That caution keeps the discussion alive. There is also the matter of contrast. Early expectations were expansive. The shift from expansion to restraint is noticeable. People naturally compare what was anticipated with what is unfolding. Gaps between the two invite analysis. Online commentary reflects this dynamic. Discussions are less reactive and more reflective. People revisit earlier moments, not to assign blame, but to understand how trajectories change. This backward-looking curiosity is a sign that the story has entered a longer phase. Another reason the story persists is its relevance beyond the individual. Many viewers see it as illustrative. It raises broader questions about how modern influence works and where its limits lie. These questions resonate in an era where visibility is often mistaken for control. Institutions, by remaining quiet, unintentionally contribute to the narrative. Silence is not neutral in public life. It creates space for interpretation. Even when restraint is intentional, it shapes perception. Supporters and critics alike seem to agree on one point: the situation feels unresolved. That shared sense keeps attention focused. When both sides wait for clarity, discussion continues. There is also a psychological element. Audiences are accustomed to fast cycles. When a story slows instead of ending, it feels unfinished. People return to it, expecting resolution that does not arrive. Importantly, this persistence does not imply escalation. The tone remains measured. The questions remain open. No new claims have surfaced to redefine the situation dramatically. The story continues because it has not concluded, not because it has intensified. This ongoing nature changes how it is discussed. Instead of speculation about immediate outcomes, conversations turn to long-term implications. What does this mean for future collaborations? How will trust be rebuilt, if at all? What adjustments might follow? These questions extend beyond the individual. They speak to how systems adapt when boundaries are tested. They invite reflection rather than judgment. As time passes, the story becomes less about events and more about lessons. Observers extract meaning from patterns. Analysts consider what this reveals about modern public life. And because these lessons are still forming, attention remains. The story functions as a living example, evolving slowly as circumstances shift. This is why it continues to surface in commentary SB. Aces, not because of scandal, but because of uncertainty. And uncertainty, when paired with visibility, rarely disappears on its own. As the discussion moves forward, it does so quietly, without clear markers. There may be a turning point ahead, or the story may gradually dissolve as new narratives take its place. For now, it remains suspended, not resolved, not dismissed, simply ongoing. And that, more than any single event, explains why people are still watching. As we reach this point, it is worth slowing down and looking at what this story actually represents, not in terms of headlines or speculation, but in terms of how public life now unfolds. Nothing about this situation has been loud. There has been no single statement that changed everything, no moment that clearly marked an ending. Instead, the story has moved quietly, shaped by pauses, adjustments, and careful distance. That quiet is important. In modern public culture, noise is often mistaken for truth, but some of the most meaningful shifts happen without announcement. They happen when systems recalibrate and people adapt their behavior accordingly. This story sits in that space. It is not about proven facts or formal conclusions. It is about observation, about how momentum can slow, about how expectations meet structure, about how visibility does not always produce control. For the audience, this can feel unsettling. People want clarity. They want a reason they can point to and say, "This is why." But real life rarely offers that simplicity, especially in environments where reputation, money, and influence overlap. What we are seeing instead is a process, one that is still unfolding, one that may never end with a definitive answer, and that is not failure, it is reality. The figure at the center of this discussion remains visible, but differently so, less surrounded by certainty, more defined by questions. That shift alone explains much of the continued attention. At the same time, institutions continue doing what they always do. They protect stability, they reduce risk, they wait for clarity before committing. None of this requires public explanation. For viewers, the lesson may be less about the individual and more about the system, about how modern influence works, about how quickly narratives can change when structure replaces novelty. This does not mean the story ends here. It simply means it pauses, as it has before. It remains present without demanding resolution. And perhaps that is the most honest way to understand it, not as a rise or a fall, but as a transition still finding its shape. In the coming months, attention may drift, or it may sharpen again if circumstances change. Either outcome would fit the pattern we have seen so far. Until then, the story remains what it has been from the start, a quiet unfolding, observed rather than declared, shaped more by absence than announcement. And for those watching closely, that silence continues to say just enough to keep the conversation alive.